Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. We want to welcome you guys to Terminal AMA. We're going to give people a few minutes to get settled in before we get started. So again, thank you guys for being on time. If we can just wait just a few minutes, we'll get started. Thank you. Good morning, or good afternoon from wherever you're calling. We want to welcome you to episode 6 of Terminal's AMA series, where you can connect with the industry's brightest minds from some of the most innovative companies and get their thoughts on the ever-changing tech landscape and all things related to the future of work. We're thrilled to welcome today's featured guest, Principal at Mango Tech and Distinguished Remote Teams Leader and Advocate, Dave Mangot. He'll be joined in conversation with Terminal's Remote Teams Advisor, Colin O'Connor. I'll let our wonderful co-hosts introduce themselves further in just a bit, but before that, quick reminder on housekeeping items. All AMAs are live streamed and they'll be on YouTube, and we'll post a recording at the end of today's discussion. As part of the registration for today's event, a number of you submitted questions that Dave will be sure to get to, but if you have additional questions over the course of the conversation, please type them into the Q&A function and we'll get to as many of them as we can. With that said, there's a lot to get to today, so I'll pass it over to Colin, who will introduce himself and our special guests for today. Colin, take it away.
Thanks, Dorian. Just want to make sure you guys can hear me all right now. Thanks. Okay. Hi, everyone. I am Colin O'Connor, Remote Teams Advisor here at Terminal. Just to give you a little background on myself as well as our business. I was at a company acquired by WeWork last year, and I saw how many startups were building remote satellite hub offices around the United States and globally. And I learned that it's not just giving people co-working and office perks to make sure that there's a retained team and people are happy. You need a lot more than that to have a retained team. Productivity and overall happiness needs to be higher. So that's what brought me to Terminal. Terminal is a dedicated partner in standing up world-class remote technical teams. We provide startups with the core services and infrastructure necessary to successfully build and scale remote teams. We focus on everything necessary from sourcing, setup, and to support these teams, from physical elements like the beautiful workspaces and to ongoing support like HR, payroll, legal, and professional learning and development. And to date, we've built remote teams for over 40 startups, including Chime, Nextdoor, Dialpad, Gusto, and a few others. And joining us today, really excited, is Dave Mangot. Dave is the principal at Mango Tech, and he successfully led DevOps transformations for companies like Salesforce, Cable and Wireless, and most recently SolarWinds. He's held roles from systems engineers to architect and from tech lead to global director. So really excited to have you here today, Dave. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I've been doing, remote work and distributed teams since 2001, I think. So it's been a pretty good journey so far.
Nice. And I think that's a good place to start. So, flashing back to, let's say, the mid 90s, you just graduated from Johns Hopkins in Baltimore with a degree in cognitive science. What were things like back then, and how did you end up in tech?
Well, I went to work for a government laboratory at NIH doing neuroscience research. Uh, I wasn't doing the research. I was helping people do research. And kind of over time, I got into a situation where the person who was responsible for all the computers in the laboratory would say, I don't know how to do this. Can you help me figure it out? And at Hopkins, I'd taken classes in C programming and Unix and all kinds of stuff like that as part of my degree. So I was super happy to kind of jump in and help out. And then fast forward to moving to California, and I kind of had intended to go to graduate school, and I couldn't really find a job. And it was unbeknownst to me, it was the dot-com boom. I didn't really know that. And I couldn't find a job. I kept trying to get back into medical research, and a friend of mine said, "Hey, don't you know Unix?" And I said, "I know some Unix." And so I wound up getting involved with this company. I bought a book on Unix administration, read the book over the weekend, went in and faked my way through the interview on Monday, and started working at Sun Microsystems. So kind of dropping you right into like one of the most advanced tech companies at the time. And just because there was so much demand for people who knew technology, I certainly never went back to graduate school. I've sort of stayed in Silicon Valley and sort of made a career out of it ever since then. And it's been quite a wild ride, I'd say.
Very nice. Thanks for sharing. And, I guess fast forwarding to today, we're in 2020. There's quite a few things going on. Most recently, we've seen quite a few tech companies, bigger ones in the Valley here, announce, either temporary work from home policies or even indefinite ones. So, a lot of these changes trickle down to smaller startups in the ecosystem. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that, given your experience, building global teams and how, you're thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't really matter like the size of your company. I think that, what people have learned, and, to be clear, like people who are working from home now aren't really working from home. They're working during a pandemic from their house, which it's not the same thing, right? There's a culture that's involved uh, in working remotely and having distributed teams, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later because I've written some things about this. But my job in my consulting business is to work on the culture of companies. So what I really do is I help operations teams achieve parity with the development teams. But all of that really comes down to culture. It doesn't come down to tools or whether you use Jira or Slack or any of that other stuff. It's how are you approaching these problems. And so whether you're a small startup or whether you're a major corporation, it's whether or not you're putting the culture in place that allows your distributed teams to thrive. And if you try to treat your distributed teams like they're still in an office, you're going to have problems. If you try to treat your distributed teams in ways that facilitate transparency and communication and incentivize the right outcomes and things like that, that's when you can actually be successful. So I think any company can be a successful distributed team company. It's the size is irrelevant, but it's really about putting the right structures in place.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. And we'll definitely get into that later on, especially with your experiences. And I know you've written quite a few articles on CIO.com as a contributing writer there. And definitely want to dive into that later on in the discussion. So, you've had experiences at places like Salesforce.com as an architect on the infrastructure engineering team, and most recently SolarWinds as the global head of site reliability engineering. These are both globally distributed teams, making sure services were available for customers 24/7. So starting with SolarWinds, in 2015, it sounded like you were recruited by the CTO of Librato at the time to prepare for the acquisition of SolarWinds by private equity firm Thoma Bravo. Must have been a really exciting time in your career. I'd love to hear about, at SolarWinds, how the teams were structured and any challenges you encountered during this time.
Yeah, it was a pretty exciting time. I mean, when I took that job, I kind of had two offers on the table that I had narrowed it down to, and that job at Librato, the people there were so talented and doing such amazing stuff that it was really intimidating and it was scary. And I was like, I don't know if I should take this job because everyone's going to find out, the fraud that I am, which is, even with all the years of experience, imposter syndrome is real. But wound up going onto that team and working with Librato, and they, were fantastic, and we did all kinds of great stuff there. And they were already a distributed team. I mean, so that company was set up that way, from very early on. And then as SolarWinds was expanding more and more into the cloud space, which is not a traditional space for them, they acquired other companies like Papertrail. They had already acquired Pingdom. And as the size of the cloud offering grew, I was given more and more teams to work with. And the interesting thing about, most of those teams, not Pingdom necessarily, but some of the other ones, they were distributed teams. I mean, that's, the way that they were accustomed to working. So the interesting challenge became, we have a bunch of companies that are used to working distributed. How do we keep them working distributed, but also get them to work with one another, right? We didn't want to have 3 silos, 5 silos of companies that do everything completely different. We wanted to be able to leverage, the best parts of each of them. And so I wound up, eventually having a pretty sizable SRE team underneath me that was composed of multiple different companies. And we were able to, do things, wrote about like on my blog, but do things like have, weekly architecture meetings where everybody could come and contribute. So it didn't matter like which company you were on. If you were in Librato and you were trying to solve some kind of problem, you could present to like an architecture meeting that said like, hey, this is how we're thinking about solving the problem. These are the pros, these are the cons. And then you could get feedback from all kinds of other people who have all kinds of different experience saying like, yeah, that's a great idea, or don't do it like that. You might want to think about it like this, or here are the things that could bite you or whatever. But like transforming multiple distributed teams into sort of, I always called it like operating at 2 levels. One is like the team level, but the other is the organization level. Was really exciting, and it was a fun challenge. And like I said at the beginning of it, these were such talented people. I feel like my job was pretty easy.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we're seeing, especially recently, for engineering, given how competitive it is in the United States, is companies are looking now more than ever to build teams, global teams that are distributed. So it sounds like that's what you were dealing with at SolarWinds. What's your take on engineering talent outside the U.S.? I think at SolarWinds you work with teams in South America and in other countries. So we'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, there's one of the challenges of having lived here in Silicon Valley for so long is, there's a talent pool, but that's it. That's the talent pool. And so if you want to recruit engineers out of this talent pool, then you're going to be competing with, all your FANG companies, Facebooks, Apples, Google, all that fun stuff, who have a ton of money to throw around. And so if you have that kind of money to throw around, then, you're going to be able to get certain kinds of talent. And so I think the ability to go distributed and find talent wherever the talent is and work with the talent wherever they are opens up that talent pool tremendously. And certainly there's no monopoly that Silicon Valley has on talent where there's no talent anywhere else. I mean, there's talent all over the world. And like you said, I worked with people in Brazil. I still continue to work with people in Brazil and Costa Rica and places like that. And there's all kinds of, places like Medellin, Colombia, which are just like exploding in their tech scenes. And you can see this by like the DevOps days that pop up all over South America now. And the thing I love working with the South American teams for is that the time zones are so much easier to deal with. I mean, I've managed teams in Sweden and India and all kinds of stuff, and the time zones can get really difficult. And there is, even on the best distributed teams, like there needs to be interaction between people. There needs to be human connection between people. And so working with the South American and Central American countries makes that a lot easier.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that with a lot of the CTOs and VPs of engineering that we're speaking with. Is you can definitely find talent all over the world, but there are other considerations to take into consider or to factor in, like the time zone alignment, outside of having the right communication styles and being able to understand one another. So I appreciate you shedding some light on that. When it comes to, you wrote an article on CIO.com back in January on engineering the hiring of engineers. And around the same time, Terminal actually conducted a research study of about 500 software engineers in North America. And one of the key findings from our study was that 90% of engineers found or had at least one issue with the general interview process, with things like disorganization, being interviewed by people who don't understand the role, long delays, and just too many rounds of interviews. So when it comes to building engineering teams globally in the hiring process, what tips do you have for engineering leaders, or what should they be thinking about when building teams like this?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the reason I wrote that article and called it the engineering the hiring of engineers was, this idea of engineering, and those of us who are engineers or have been engineers or whatever, like we like to build things, right? And to build things, that means you need to be deliberate about what you're building. Like very few projects that anyone could ever build are successful if there's no planning, there's no thought, there's no, intention there. And unfortunately, I think in our industry, like we're pretty terrible at hiring. There's not a lot of intention. There's a lot of like, well, why don't you talk to them? Okay, well, why don't you talk to them next? And a lot of times it's like, well, what does that mean? Like, what do you want? What do you want me to get out of the interview? Like, what do you want me to talk to them about? And so I think really being deliberate about what you're trying to do when you're hiring goes a long way. And it sounds kind of simplistic and silly to be even saying that, but we don't engineer our hiring processes. We kind of throw some things together. I mean, I've worked at companies where when we would interview people, they would say, what position am I interviewing for? And we're like, I don't know. We'll interview you and then we'll let you know where you might fit in, which, I mean, this is kind of a crazy situation, right, to walk into. And so when I say like engineering the hiring of engineers, I mean, as we do this, this is why we're doing this. As we do this, this is why we're doing this. And so when you're hiring for remote or distributed teams, that becomes, it's not actually any more important. It's just as important when you're doing that. I guess it's possible that it's more important because these people are not going to be sitting next to you. But so one of the things that we did, when we were engineering our process at SolarWinds is, we mapped it out. We were very deliberate. These are the stages. These are the outcomes of this stage. These are the things that are going to get covered. This is why we're going to do it. And, we were incredibly respectful to the people we were interviewing because, these are people that we want to work with, and we want to show them that this is the kind of team that you're going to be on, that's respectful and, you know, takes your your needs and your things in mind. And so one of my favorite parts of it was the engineers, and this was not me, like this was the engineering team came up with this, was they did group interviews, but with small groups. Like we never wanted to have like a large panel because 6 or 8 people on one is sort of a very intimidating and not not a great experience for the person being interviewed. But we would break up into small teams, and they would do maybe 2 or 3 people interviewing a candidate, but they would say like, hey, say we had this problem, and it was some kind of typical thing that we might bump into at work, like how would we work through this, what would you be looking for, what who would you talk to, what kind of questions would you ask? But like these very like put the person in a situation that you would expect them to work in, and see how they respond, see what they're thinking about, see how they approach the problem, things like that. And then there were certain things that we were certainly looking for, but there are also things that like, hey, wow, we never even thought of that, that's a really great idea, or wow, you have this experience that nobody else has, I could see that being really valuable. What we didn't do is like silly things like, hey, you're going to do a whiteboard coding test, because no one's going to whiteboard code at their job. Nobody shows up for work on Monday and is like, oh, here's my dry erase marker, I'm ready to go to work. Like that's not a thing. Like, and so, we were really very deliberate about the choices that we made when we were doing this the hiring of engineers, so that we could really get a feel for what these candidates are going to be like, and really what these candidates are going to be like to work with, because that's like ultimately what the goal of the whole process was.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, creating a deliberate, supportive environment is really important for any employee, no matter where they are located. At headquarters or at a satellite office or working from home, and leadership and management as well need to make sure that that new employee that arrives on day one is taken care of in a deliberate way, so that they have that psychological safety. I remember reading, I think Google Rework project, they had a study that found that how important psychological safety is when it comes to retention of employees. So,
number one,
yep, really important
is the
stuff
number
there.
one. That's the number one indicator of high performing teams: psychological safety.
Got it.
Which is hilarious. Well, as we're all engineers, we're all technical. And then it turns out the highest performing teams are the ones that have the most psychological safety, which is, it's just fantastic. And that's really great for, like you said, like this whole idea of remote work and distributed teams, because then it's not about having like everyone who went to MIT. It's about like putting people in positions where they can really succeed.
Nice. Totally agree with that. I was speaking with the CTO a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned that, right now is definitely, as you stated, a different time. People are, working from home in a pandemic, children and other obligations that they have to deal with. When employees start going back to work, he brought up the topic of inclusion and how teams may or may not deal with the challenge of making sure all teammates are included no matter where they are. Do you have any thoughts or any like tips on that piece there?
Well, I mean, the first one is to be deliberate, but to your point, when teams are going back to the offices and things like that, make no mistake, it will be a fundamentally different experience, right? If you've never worked distributed before and now you've been working distributed for a few months, that's going to change you. I mean, there's just no question about it. And it's interesting because I think a lot of teams are going to learn a lot of things about themselves, about things that maybe they took for granted, or how it was for that one teammate who was remote compared to the rest of the team and what their experience was like. And I think it's great. I think it's going to be a learning experience. Obviously, this is not a learning experience that we would like to have, forced upon us, because of why it is being forced upon us. But I think it's going to help people grow, and I think people are going to spend a lot more time thinking about, how do we communicate? How are we transparent? How do we let people know what we're doing? And there's a lot of cool things that people can do. One of the things that we did at Salesforce that I loved, that I've taken everywhere, is we do the sprint demos at the end of every sprint or every iteration or whatever you want to call it. Where people show off working software. That's Agile, straight out of the Agile book. But what we used to do is we used to record those demos and we would post them so that anybody anywhere in the world could participate and see those demos. And at Salesforce, we put it on Chatter, which was it's their sort of version of business Facebook. But we could get comments from people in Singapore or get comments from people in Sweden and say hey, I saw what you're doing. My team would love to leverage this. Is there any way we can set up, some kind of collaboration or whatever? But it's that, deliberate communication that is facilitated, through intention. And so, that really allows those teams to be successful. And I think that teams that are right now forced distributed, when they go back into a more normal situation, I think they're going to have made a lot of advances as a team.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that, not only in terms of obviously the tooling, but communication best practices. And I think it'll be incumbent upon leadership, especially, to make sure that their teams are remembering why they put those guidelines in the first place, to make a really inclusive culture, and make sure that their teams are still productive as they were, going forward. Kind of want to change it up a little bit. I know you do some work on the side, and you've been involved with a group called Helpful Engineering. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about Helpful Engineering, what you guys are doing there. And it sounds like you're doing some really great work, and there's a ton of people involved. So would love to hear about that.
Yeah, Helpful Engineering was and is kind of a fun experience. For an undesired reason. But we're an international open source community incubator, and we're focused on mobilizing people to help solve the COVID-19 pandemic and other critical issues. We have thousands of people all over the world, and we support projects through innovations in engineering, community resources, software, manufacturing, but again, distributed teams, right? I wandered onto the Slack for Helpful Engineering, and there was hundreds of SREs, which my peeps super happy about that. But I was kind of like, what's going on here? And they're like, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing this, we're doing that. I was like, okay, wow, all right, let's try to get a little bit of structure here. But these are engineers that are located everywhere, and the whole organization operates like that. And we've been able to get some really interesting things accomplished. I mean, hundreds of thousands of face shields have been produced using our open source designs. We're working on ventilator things with different groups in different countries. We're working on resourcing. We're working on all kinds of stuff. And it's a really vibrant culture that's operating in this very distributed manner. So thankfully, it's not 2001. We're not throwing together the tools that I was throwing together at the time to make things work. We have some pretty mature tools right now that allow people to collaborate, but also, the thing is that these people, that's part of the way that they work. So this is not new to them. They're used to working in this kind of distributed collaborative manner.
Yeah, those are all great projects, and I highly recommend anybody to check out Helpful Engineering. They're working on some really good stuff, and I've looked at quite a few of the projects myself, including the 130,000 masks and one of the projects that they had done. Going forward, how do you see, Helpful Engineering evolving after all this, hopefully ends?
I think right now a big focus of the organization is partnering with other people and helping them, be successful. So there's just different groups that are out there that sometimes don't have some of the organization that we have. We've sort of structured ourselves in this kind of incubator kind of like ideal. So that actually allows us to be very supportive. So hopefully we can get through the pandemic and we can find other projects that need the support, that maybe they need like an SRE kind of advisor or things like that. And we can just really facilitate a lot of really good, positive things happening in the world.
Awesome. We had a couple of questions submitted that were live. So I know we're just at about time here. Want to get through one or two of these real quick, if you don't mind, Dave.
I'll talk fast.
How do you think about starting a remote organization?
I think, the thing that's most important is to find the right people who have the right attitude. The tools are out there. The tools aren't hard to find. If you want to partner with a company like Terminal, I think that's a fantastic way to get started because there's a lot of expertise there. But really, kind of like we talked about with engineering, the hiring of engineers, like you really need to find the people who have the right attitude and who are excited about that. Like this is something that they want to do and that it's important to them. And, there's lots of companies like out there, Zapier would be one example, who they started remote, they've been remote or distributed like their whole existence. That's just the way that they've been. And so I think you really just have to start with like the right attitude and the right people. And, just like in Agile, you learn, you iterate, you run experiments, you see what works, you see what doesn't work. Certainly, you can learn from prior art, but at the same time, like, people learn and people grow. And as long as they're open to that learning and growing, there's a pretty good chance they can be successful.
Awesome. Dave, really appreciate all the insights here. We have a lot of companies that are thinking about remote and distributed teams for the first time as of the last couple months, and there will be more that will come in the future to build their own teams when they get started. So really appreciate the conversation today. For everyone out there, if there's any other advice that you want or to want to continue the conversation, I encourage you to check out resources like the Remote Teams Playbook on terminal.io's website, or you can reach out to people like myself or Dave to continue the conversation and hopefully move forward in building strong global engineering teams. Any parting thoughts on your end, Dave?
I just want everyone to, realize that this is not normal. Like if your kids are pulling on your leg when you're trying to work, like that's not normal. I mean, you can see I kind of have maybe it's a closet, but it's a separate space that's designed specifically for remote work. And so, we'll get through this together as long as we all act together. And we're all, hopefully, those of us who are now learning all this kinds of stuff about remote work will have much happier, time when they're going back to work and are much more able to do all the things that a lot of us who've been doing this a long time have really, embraced and taken advantage of.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Dave, and thank you for everyone for joining us. You can check out our website. We'll have future AMAs in the future, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.